You're now listening to the first installment of Felix firing off from afar for the flyover. And I'm going to begin by unpacking something Chris Hedges said in a talk he gave a while back titled Wages of Rebellion.
It is not our job to take power. It is our job to stand fast around a moral imperative and make power frightened of us. The last liberal president we had was Richard Nixon, not because he was a liberal or had a conscience, but because he was frightened of movements. The Mine and Safety Act, the Clean Water Act, OSHA, all written by Nader, were passed by Nixon. There's a moment in Kissinger's memoirs, do not buy the book, where it's 1971 and there are thousands of anti-war demonstrators around the White House, and Nixon has put empty city buses end to end as barricades around the White House, and he looks out the window and he says to Kissinger, "Henry, they're going to break through the barricades and get us." And that's just where people in power have to be.
And so while we can appreciate the Nixon anecdote, for sure, I still think some of the things that Hedges seems to be suggesting there are somewhat problematic. So I'm also not advocating taking power, seizing levers of concentrated power to wield it over others. But I do think a displacement of power and cultivation of mutual empowerment necessary to do that is something Hedges fails to stress. And so I'd like to compare that with something that hip-hop artist Boots Riley said in a recent web-exclusive interview with Amy Goodman on Democracy Now! With respect to electoral politics, something that I believe is consonant with an anarchist critique.
And we have more, more police murders.
Do you see elections serving a purpose if you didn't see elections as being about electing a leader who will then do all that you supposedly want them to do?
Yeah, well, and that's part of the problem, though. How do you get people to vote unless you tell them this is the ultimate thing?
Or you see a politician, simply the person who is elected, opening a door so it's not always a wall that people are up against. That's just the beginning of the work when people are elected. It's about opening doors for the mass of people to start organizing.
That would be great if elections really worked that way, but they don't. I mean, we saw the first anti-war movement that turned into a pro-Kerry movement. I mean, not the first one, but the first anti-Iraq war movement that turned into a pro-Kerry movement. And it was like, this dude wasn't even saying we're going to be against the war, but all of these left and liberal folks, knowing we lied to a lot of people, saying that Kerry was against the war, and that decimated the anti-war movement. There was no anti-war movement. People went and voted, and that was it. Then the next time it built up again, it turned into an pro-Obama movement. And believe me, a lot of my family was involved in the grassroots part of that, and it was talked about how much networks were built, and they were doing a lot of work. Over with as soon as the campaign is over. You know why? Because it takes a lot of work. And how do you motivate people to get anyone elected? The way you motivate them is you tell them this is a game changer. You can't say, hey, this is part of a 12-point program and this is just one step, because you're not going to get people to get out of their bed and go get in go to the voting booth unless you change it. I mean, some of the folks that were pump voter and independent voter, for instance, are friends of mine. And I was in Florida during the Kerry campaign, and they had a checklist. Bush is for the war, and Kerry is against the war. It was a lie. And that's what's happening. People, you end up going for the lesser of two evils, and even in that, you have to tell people it's a game changer. Historically, elections have not left over a movement afterward. So, I mean, if we just look at how it works, and again, this idea is something that's relatively new, has been since the New Left has been here. It's not, I mean, that was not our milieu that we worked in. I don't think it works. It had.
And so again, very much in accord with an anarchist critique of electoral politics. And in that interview, Boots also said something to Amy Goodman about the need for a material basis for creating the sort of culture with far fewer oppressive relations of power over. And we'll get to that in a moment. And he also had addressed the confusing analysis of the system that we're sometimes given, or that we are responsible for giving to folks who could potentially be involved in different types of resistance. And so I'm just going to go ahead and let Boots explain that.
We have to talk about what creates culture? How do we create the culture that we want? And we're not going to create the culture that we want simply by going and editing the culture that capitalism produces. We're going to create the culture that I came out of a movement. You know, that movement is small, so it's produced one of me, right? If that movement gets bigger, there'll be a lot more of me. And there'll be all sorts of levels that are based on that are based on people's understanding of the system. You know, right now we're giving people kind of a confusing understanding of the system, like it's all about marches, it's all about this, and that's very important. But we got to get people to understand that your survival and financial well-being is wrapped up in radical militant action.
And so I think Boots is exactly right. I would underscore that unsanctioned street protests and marches and demonstrations can oftentimes visibilize people's indignation against otherwise invisible structural violence, rendering transparent cultures of cruelty, making it apparent that existing institutions that we have are responsible for the injustices that people are felt and living in their lives, and prompt people to consider ways those might be dismantled. Perhaps even get us thinking about reorganizing structures from below in non-exploitative and non-dominating ways. And so something like an unsanctioned street march might open doors. They can function pedagogically, meaning there's some education involved. It can teach those of us who participate how the state responds, and can get us thinking about why the state brutally represses and in some cases strategically manages dissent. But those street protests are not alone sufficient. I don't think they can be seen as something that we should be getting people excited about first, and then hoping that a revolutionary scenario ensues as a result of people's participation in street protests, which, despite the lack of sanctioning and the civil disobedience that's often involved, still take place within certain parameters. And the expectation that a revolutionary scenario might arise from just getting out on the streets, I think that's flawed for one, and it's actually very reminiscent of orthodox socialist strategy, and I don't think it works or will work well. Now, in relation, Marxian geographer David Harvey recently gave a talk on the revolutionary class today, and the approximately 12-minute video is available on his website, davidharvey.org, and he attempts to answer the pressing question, who is the present-day working class? I mean, who has that revolutionary potential, and then how to organize them. And he makes the argument that they can't be organized in the old industrial way. And so I'm going to play a segment of David Harvey speaking to that.
Working class as people who actually produce cars or steel. But why should we say they are working class and that the person who produces a hamburger is not? In fact, all those hamburger workers are productive of value and having surplus value extracted from them. The whole restaurant industry of New York is productive of value and is having surplus value extracted from it. The interesting thing about the restaurant industry is that by and large the owners don't make much money because they're paying so much in rent that it's the rentier who gets the value. The landlord gets the value, not the direct producer. In fact, a lot of the restaurant owners I know exploit themselves to the hilt to pay the rent. This is what I mean about this form of extraction. What else do I see at 86th and 2nd Avenue? I see the workers from the electricity company digging up the thing to put in the cables. They're producing value, surplus value. On the other side of the street, the telephone company is digging up the street to lay cables and that. They're producing value and surplus value. I see people putting up scaffolding to repair a building on one side of the street. They're producing value and surplus value. And there are people taking down scaffolding on the other side of the street. They're producing value and surplus value. And you could just go on like this, and actually what you see around you is an immense amount of production of value and surplus value in urban life by a working class, and that is the contemporary working class in a typical North American city. It's extremely difficult to organize. It doesn't fit with the idea of the steel worker or the auto worker. It's highly feminized.
And so I think Harvey's description of the contemporary working class in the typical American city also applies in many instances to the working class in smaller cities and rural towns as well. And I think something else that Harvey said is probably relevant for our discussion. He speaks to the anarchist tradition of organizing in neighborhoods and its superiority in contrast to the prototypical orthodox Marxist approach to organization. And so I'll let him speak to that.
It was mentioned earlier, one of the things that the anarchists have a better tradition of than the Marxists is organizing whole neighborhoods. The anarchists have a much better positionality sometimes about being embedded in daily life of communities and thinking about ways to try to find an unalienated existence in a sea of alienation. And this actually then brings me to a very interesting kind of point, that actually a lot of the mobilization going on in cities does indeed rest upon sort of anarchist, autonomist principles, which is very hard, I think, for Marxists to recognize and to understand. I actually find myself very much in agreement with a past anarchist, Murray Bookchin, who kind of said, I think that the future of the left depends crucially on putting together the best of anarchism and the best of Marxism. And unless those two anti-capitalist perspectives can be put together in a political process, the left is doomed to failure. This is one of the things he wrote in one of his last essays. He severed himself from the anarchist tradition because he couldn't stand the dogmatic anarchists. I've had a hard time in the Marxist tradition with the dogmatic Marxists. The dogmatic Marxists and the dogmatic anarchists should go to hell.
And so this notion of dogmatism, I think, is worth talking about for a minute. So I distinguish dogmatism from conviction and principles. So many anarchists have the principle of rejection of power over and an ethic of anti-authoritarianism that need not be sacrificed, and the refusal to sacrifice it cannot be equated, I don't think, with dogmatism. But when a doctrinaire approach prevents someone from critically reflecting upon the contradictions in their own political activity or the shortcomings in terms of living up to professed principles and ethics of mutual aid or anti-authoritarianism, etc., then the dogma has to be challenged and contested, and I'd argue has to go. And so, just to give one example, anarchist geographer Simon Springer, who exchanged a few essays of argumentation with David Harvey, I would argue has, at least from what's apparent in some of his scholarly work, a doctrinaire philosophy of nonviolence. And there is a blog post on the Flyerville InfoShop website that addresses this in one of his works. Springer writes that all violence is deplorable. Now, if based on his work wherein he refers to both violence from above and violence from below explicitly, we can then, I guess, assume he understands any use of physical force against other human beings or living things as forms of violence. Then what does it mean to refer to all violence, including the violence from above, violence from below, any use of physical force against another human being or living thing, as deplorable? Is the physical force of, say, the women's protection units defending the Rojava Revolution from the Turkish state's attempt to repress the Kurdish struggle, or the efforts, or the Kurds' use of physical force against the Islamic State, which is attempting to defeat them militarily to advance a highly authoritarian and, as human rights groups have shown, femicidal conception of what society, the hierarchical state they want to impose, would look like. And so I guess in this, I disagree slightly with revolutionary prisoner Sean Swain, who had criticized those in the United States for criticizing ISIS. To be sure, the onus is upon us to call out the role of the United States in participating in terror and fomenting it, and also creating the conditions in which something like the Islamic State could emerge. As journalist Jeremy Scales pointed out, many of the leading officers for the Islamic State were former officers under Saddam Hussein's secular Ba'athist regime in Iraq before the U.S. invasion, and the U.S. taking a sledgehammer to that society, igniting all sorts of sectarian divisions, and also leaving 250,000 Ba'athist military personnel with nothing to do, and they went from a secular regime to joining a very authoritarian fundamentalist, religious fundamentalist one. So if we can't recognize that the fight for Rojava against the Islamic State and Turkey, which has historically been backed by the U.S., which is a fight for directly democratic and ostensibly an anti-capitalist revolution against an oppressive forces, albeit one that emerged in the wake of U.S. state terror in the region, then if we can't recognize that, we have a real problem. Now, in relation to this, the DAF, the Revolutionary Anarchist Action Organization, which is based in Turkey, for example, has supported the Rojava Revolution and the recent declarations of self-governance in Turkish Kurdistan. In an interview with Corporate Watch, reposted at Roar Magazine, roarmag.org, DAF members said a few things that I think are relevant for this edition of Félix Firing Off. So when asked about the bombing of Saruk in Turkey, which took place on July 20th, they explained, more than 30 people who wanted to take part in reconstruction of Kobani were killed by an ISIS attack. This attack was clearly organized by the Turkish state. They did not even do anything to stop it, although they got the information of the attack 1 month before. Moreover, after the explosion of the Turkish state attacked Rojava and launched operations against political organizations in Turkey. Now there are many operations and political pressures on anarchists and socialists and Kurdish organizations. They are using the explosion as a reason to make this political repression on both the domestic and international levels. We've lost 33 of our comrades, friends, who struggled for the Rojava Revolution against the state's repression, denial, and politics and massacre. There are people who are killed by the state, ISIS, and other powers. But our resistance won't stop. Our struggle will continue, as always in history. Now, the massacre in the eyes of many on the ground illustrates the coziness the Turkish state has, or seems to have, with the Islamic State, and their mutual objective of wiping out anarchist and socialist movements, especially self-governance initiatives that could provide concrete inspiration for others. And so the DAF members made other points germane to the imperative of reconceiving and recasting organizing strategy, which seems to be a recurring theme in this first edition of Félix Firing Off. So the DAF said in that interview that the main issue for DAF is to organize anarchism within society. We try to socialize anarchism with struggle on the streets. This is what we give importance to. For nearly 9 years, we've been doing this. They went on to say, other anarchists have approached anarchism as an imitation of US or European anarchism or as an underground culture. If we want to make the anarchist movement a social movement, it must change. And then they went on and continued to say that with respect to self-organized spaces that are explicitly anti-capitalist, like cafes in Turkey, like the 26A Cafe in Taksim, the DAF said, they are aimed at creating an economic model in the place where oppressed people are living. It's important to show people concrete examples of an anarchist economy without bosses or capitalist aims. And so I think this returns us to the Harvey-endorsed Bookchin approach of community-based or neighborhood-based organizing in assemblies. And I think that powerful assembly-oriented, neighborhood-oriented strategy has to be coupled with a potent class analysis and action within, against, and beyond the capitalist industry, which we're also tethered to at the moment. And so this has been argued by other folks within various traditions. Richard Wolff, a Marxian economist, is a proponent of worker self-directed enterprises, has a book, Democracy at Work, which details this. Michael Albert, who came out of the New Left, specifically radical wing of Students for Democratic Society, which were the SDS being big proponents of participatory democracy. Albert now has sort of formulated a model of participatory economics, and then recently the historian and political economist Garl Purovitz has specifically tailored a plan for democratizing wealth and ownership within the United States. So all of those have what we might call an economic focus, and all of those thinkers and more have essentially said that work is where we spend most of our waking lives. We're coerced into performing abstract labor, that is, working for a wage rather than self-determined human doing. And most radicals I know still are forced to acquire much of what they need to survive as commodities. They have to get it through the market. Struggles for higher wages within capitalist economy can, I think, embolden people, can challenge the hegemony of the coordinator class, that is, the, let's say, roughly 20% of the population, according to Michael Albert, who monopolize all of the empowering decisions and get to exercise some authority, whereas the majority of people are stuck doing disempowering work and don't feel empowered, but actually challenging those relations can be quite empowering. Wayne Price, author of The Value of Radical Theory and Anarchist Introduction to Marxist Critique of Political Economy, some recorded readings of which are available on the Flyover InfoShop website, flyoverinfoshop.org. He makes an argument for anarchist recognition of the ongoing salience of the labor theory of value. That is, those who are directly producing value, as well as, we might say, those who are responsible and take care of the reproductive and unpaid social labor that goes into reproducing the people who directly produce value. We have to recognize the new normalization of exploitation, how a sliver of society profits off of what we do. And more on this in a future Felix Firing Off segment. But turn now back to something that that has to do with Boots Riley, who we mentioned before. So there's a book review at Truth Out. The title of that article is Tell Homeland Security We Are the Bomb, Boots Riley's Rhymes and Revolutionary Philosophy, and authored by a really astute doctoral candidate at Southern Illinois University, Carbondale. And it's a review of Boots's book, Tell Homeland Security We Are the Bomb. In the article, the author paraphrases the analysis offered by the aforementioned hip-hop artist Boots Riley at the 2015 Socialism Conference there in Chicago. And there Riley had emphasized the inherent class antagonism within capitalist society as being in large part responsible for much of the police violence and community-destroying prison industrial complex. And so, as the article reads, the system needs unemployment because it puts downward pressure on wages, Riley told those in attendance at the conference in Chicago. Yet unemployed people need to eat. This means there must be an illegal economy in existence enabling the superfluous population to survive. But that illicit business is inevitably met with violence from the state. All business requires violence to protect it, Riley explained. Legal business has a state to serve that purpose. Illegal business must regulate itself with violence as well. Illegal business is where most street violence comes from. The only way to stop street violence would be to get rid of the need for the illegal economy. As people hustle to survive in the informal economy, deadly and demeaning encounters with law enforcement occur. And so his overarching point, paraphrased there, Riley's overarching point, paraphrased in the article, is that the necessity of police violence is inbuilt in the system. And now, also of interest to us, I think, Riley has noted that Occupy Oakland had the largest participation of black persons of any social movement that he had been a part of. And so, as the Truth Out book review mentioned, part of this had to do with how occupiers would go out for drinks and foster camaraderie after assemblies or after demonstrations. And so I think it's safe to say that lots of people don't have a lot of fun under capitalism, oftentimes. I think it's absolutely essential then that these recreational activities where camaraderie can be cultivated are not so readily dismissed. So recreational drinking might have its downsides sometimes, but it is a long and storied working class activity that a lot of people enjoy doing and are going to do regardless of whether it's centered around a kind of radical movement or not. And that sort of thing should be acknowledged. But point being, Occupy's reintroduction of sociality that is transcending the hyper-individualist focus that predominates today, the focus on the individual as someone out to maximize his or her own self-interest, will Occupy's reintroduction of sociality through horizontality, that is, relations without power differentials, through direct democracy, direct democratic decision-making in general assemblies, and other prefigurative political practices trying to, within the forms of organizing, doing that in such a way that reflects the kind of non-exploitative, non-authoritarian relations you'd like to see on a wider scale in the future. That, as well as how all of that bled over into a kind of party environment, into that recreational activity, at least in Oakland, which is one of the more militant occupations. I think the combination of all that, that's something to think about in terms of organizing efforts. And so it's a cliche to say that Occupy Wall Street also reintroduced the subject of inequality and class into popular discourse with the 99% versus 1% slogan. And it also, of course, offered a condemnation of finance capitalism. It was Occupy Wall Street, after all. And I think it's important to note as well that many participants themselves didn't necessarily have any trouble coming to some form of class consciousness, whether it was crude or not, could be debated, but many were, I think, as Chris Hedges, journalist, writing about Occupy at Truthdig, pointed out, were declassé. That is, downwardly mobile persons who had come from previously relatively comfortable upper working class backgrounds, who found themselves unable to find work that would pay enough for them to retain any semblance of that relative comfort, or those who had achieved a level of educational attainment, college degree or degrees, and found themselves unable to find work that would remunerate them on par with what was supposed to be expected for someone with such a college degree. And so David Harvey didn't mention this element of the working and or unemployed classes in his talk, but it's still a potentially catalytic portion, hopefully another section of the working class the rulers will have to reckon with in the future. So another point, though, is that Occupy provided a class analysis and also attracted, as Riley suggested, many poor black folks, as well as various declassé persons. I think that analysis has to be applied both in existing capitalist institutions where we perform work for wages, and in attempts to construct non-commodified spaces where the means of subsistence are held in common and we provide for ourselves in part without capital's power relations. So that class analysis has to be applied in practice in those different ways. At least I think so. And finally, if the discussion has another theme, this discussion has another theme we'd be remiss not to return to. It's the role of the state in repression and police and prisons in maintaining power relations. So not too far from Carbondale, about 2 hours north on Highway 127, there's a small rural town, Greenville, Illinois. And Jeremy Hammond, an self-identifying anarcho-communist and cyber rebel, who was sentenced in November 2003 to 10 years in U.S. federal prison for hacking the private intelligence firm Stratfor and releasing the leaks through WikiLeaks, served time in the prison located in Greenville. And there was a profile piece about him in Rolling Stone that noted Hammond was sentenced to 2 years at the Federal Correctional Institute at Greenville, Illinois, about 250 miles from Chicago. He doesn't speak very much about Greenville, but his mother suggests it was a far cry from the Cook County Jail, where he had been held on numerous occasions. The first time I went to visit him, he'd been there less than a month, and he was trembling, she says. He told me, "Mom, when I get out, I'm going to be a better person." He was scared. I thought, this is not my Jeremy. So that's disconcerting to say the least, and it's worth noting that Greenville also has a jailhouse, Bond County Jail, located there in the small town. Felix currently has a sibling who's an inmate at Bond County Jail, and those doing time at the jail, they can go more than a month without seeing sunlight, This is before they've even really, of course, gone before a judge and been convicted. And like in many prisons, the jail charges for just about everything an inmate really needs for decent survival. And if the inmate doesn't have a phone card and happens to call you from the jail, you're charged $15 for a 15-minute phone conversation. And apropos of this, hip-hop artist Immortal Technique says something in a track titled The Poverty of Philosophy, which is a title borrowed from a text by Karl Marx that was written in response to Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, an anarchist contemporary of his. And in this track, Tech says something that was cause for reflection, for me at least. So I'm going to play it so you can hear it in his own words.
In fact, I have more in common with most working and middle-class white people than I do with most rich black and Latino people. As much as racism bleeds America, we need to understand that classism is the real issue.
Now, I wouldn't necessarily say classism is more of an issue than racism, but I would say that you cannot understand racism without an analysis of the class structures necessary for capital accumulation to continue apace, for capitalism to continue to oppress, and the ways in which it represses, in conjunction with the state repressive mechanisms, affect not just people of color, but all of the working classes, those who have to sell their wage labor in order to survive. And so while politicians and powerful interests have started to pay attention to the massive prison population in the United States, which is attributable, I think, in part to movements like Nationside and Black Lives Matter and influential scholarship by folks like Christian Parenti and Michelle Alexander, the politicians and powerful interest groups are not ever going to let something like prison abolition be anything remotely part of their agenda. The state needs prisons, and capital needs both, state and prisons. To turn to history for a moment, which I think would be a good way to begin wrapping this up. As Murray Bookchin documented in his essays in the book To Remember Spain, the anarchists in Zaragoza, in Spain circa the 1930s, emphasized strikes for comrades in prison just as much as they did strikes for better wages or better working conditions. And while the old syndicalist structure that animated the anarchist revolution in Spain in 1936-37 cannot be translated into today's social world with the same sort of success without serious modification, and modifications might be made successfully, I should add, but the class-conscious, anti-capitalist, and anti-prison, anti-jail organizing that was such a big part of the Spanish anarchist movement is something that should be salient today, as should be the revolutionary vision for not just checking concentrated power, but actually displacing it. And so this has been the first installment of Felix firing off from afar for the flyover. Thanks for listening, and stay tuned for future contributions from Felix from afar. I'm going to end with a spoken word poem by Boots Riley, Underdog.
This is for my folkers who got bills overdue. This is for my folkers, check 1, 2. This is for my folkers, never lived like a hog. Me and you, toe to toe, I got love for the underdog. This is for my folkers who got bills overdue. This is for my folkers, check 1, 2. This is for my folkers, never lived like a hog. Me and you, toe to toe, I got love for the underdog. I raise this glass for the ones who died meaninglessly and the newborns who get fed intravenously. Somebody's mama caught a job and a welfare fraud case. When she breathed, she sweat, feel like plastic wrap around her face. Lights turned off. This the third month the rent is late. Thoughts of being homeless, crying till you hyperventilate. Despair permeates the air and sets in her hair. The kids play with that one toy they learned how to share. Coming home don't ever seem to be a celebration. Bills stay piled up on the coffee table like they decoration. Heaping spoons of peanut butter, a big-ass glass of water. Make the hunger subside. Save the real food for your daughter. You feel like swinging haymakers at a moving truck. Feel like laughing so it seems like you don't give a... You feel like getting so high you smoke the whole damn crop. You feel like crying, but you think that you might never stop. Homes with no heat stiffen your joints like arthritis. If this was fiction, it'd be easier to write this. Some folks try to front like they so above you. They tear this mother up if they really love you. This is for my folkers who got bills overdue. This is for my folkers, check 1, 2. This is for my folkers, never lived like a hog. Me and you, toe to toe. I got love for the underdog. There's certain tricks of the trade to try to halt your defeat, like taking Tupperware to an all-you-can-eat, returning you for news saying you lost your receipt, and writing four-figure checks when your accounts deplete. Then all your problems pile up about a mile up. Thinking about a partner you could dial up to help you out this vile stuff. Whole family sleeping on a futon while you clipping coupons, eating salad, trying to get full off the croutons. Crosstown, the situation is identical. Somebody getting strangled by the system and its tentacles. Misconceptions raised questions to be solved. A lot of dope boys is broke. A lot of homeless got jobs. You can make 8 bones an hour till you pass out and still be ass out. Most pyramid schemes don't let you cash out. They say this generation made the harmony break. The crime rise consistent with the poverty rate. You take the workers from jobs, you gon' have murders and mobs. A gang of preachers screaming sermons over murmurs and sobs, saying, pray for a change from the Lord above you. They tear this mother up if they really loved you. This is for my folkers who got bills overdue. This is for my folkers on check 1, 2. This is for my folkers never lived like a hog. Me and you, toe to toe, I got love for the underdog. You like this song because it's relatable. It's you in the rhyme. We go to stores that only let us in 2 at a time. We live in places where it costs to get your check cashed. Arguments about money usually drown out the tech blasts. Work 6 days a week, can't sleep Saturdays though. Muscles trembling like a pager when the battery's low. And you still don't know where the years went. Although every single shift feel like a year spent. And you could write your resume, but it wouldn't even mention all the life lessons learned during the 6 years of detention. And how you learned the police was just some handicappers on the ground next to broken glass and candy wrappers. So don't accept my collects on the phone. Just hit me back at the house so I know I ain't alone. And we could chop it up about this messed up system. Homies that's been killed, how we always gonna miss them. It's almost impossible surviving on this fraction. Sipping 40 to the brain for the chemical reaction. You gotta hustle, cause they're trying to push you and shove you. I tell this mother, since I really love you.